All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something pretty crucial in the world of AI, and that's how well large language models, those LLMs everyone's talking about, how well they can actually reason.
That's a big question, yeah.
Huge. And our guide for this whole deep dive is a fascinating essay, Reasoning Ability in LLMs by Jörg-Owe. Quite a name.
It is, but his work is really at the forefront of this. Schneppat digs deep.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack, what Schneppat has to say about how these LLMs think, what challenges they're up against, and, what all this means for the future. For you, the learner, it's about cutting through the jargon and getting this clear understanding of how these AI systems are trying to, think.
Absolutely. Jörg-Owe Schneppat lays it all out really well, different ways these models reason, the mechanisms behind it all, and importantly, where they fall short. We'll get into all of that.
Okay, so let's start with the theory as Schneppat breaks it down. First, there's this concept of causal reasoning. It's all about LLMs understanding how different concepts are connected, which is obviously super important for making predictions, for making decisions.
Yeah, that's the core of it. And Schneppat points out, while there's progress applying this reliably in the real world, that's still a big research area.
Right. It's not just seeing two things happen together. It's getting that why one might actually cause the other.
Exactly. As humans, we do that without even thinking, right? But for an LLM, that's a whole other level. And Jörg-Owe Schneppat's research really shows that. Identifying patterns, that's one thing, but genuinely understanding cause and effect and using it in all these different real-world situations, that's a huge challenge.
Okay, and Schneppat talks about analogical reasoning, where LLMs try to find parallels between different situations, different areas even. He gives this example of an LLM comparing arguments, like in climate policy, with arguments in economics.
Right, and you can see how that's, it's more than just recognizing patterns. It's starting to bridge those gaps between different fields, which is something we do as humans all the time. That flexibility in thinking.
Yeah, totally. It's okay, if this kind of logic works here, maybe it applies over there too. And that's a big step towards genuine understanding.
Absolutely. Jörg-Owe Schneppat really stresses how important that is for problem solving. If an LLM can see that the core structure of an argument, let's say in climate policy, mirrors one in economics, that's a deeper level of understanding than just memorizing stuff.
Right. Seeing those connections.
Yeah.
Okay, then we have the classics, inductive and deductive reasoning.
The bread and butter.
Totally. So deductive, as Schneppat explains, it's like applying general rules to specific cases, making sure that the conclusion you reach, it logically follows from those rules.
Like following a recipe, right? If the recipe says add flour and you're making a cake, you add flour. No question.
Exactly. And then inductive reasoning, that's where you kind of go the other way. Schneppat describes it as taking specific observations and then forming a more general conclusion.
So if you see a certain bird building its nest in a particular kind of tree, you might guess that species just generally prefers those trees. And Schneppat points out, this is crucial for LLMs that are dealing with massive amounts of data.
Right. If they can spot those patterns in all that data, it can lead to predictions, insights, maybe medical diagnoses or even forecasting trends.
Exactly. It's how they learn from data, essentially. And as Jörg-Owe Schneppat emphasizes, you need both of these, deduction and induction, working together for real, flexible problem solving.
It's like having all the tools, right? The logic and the ability to adapt. Okay, now Schneppat's honest about the challenges LLMs face with this whole reasoning thing. And one biggie he points out is this black box problem with neural networks. It's kind of ironic, We build these powerful tools, but we don't always fully understand how they work inside.
Yeah, it's great they can do all this amazing stuff, but if we don't know why they make a specific decision, that's a problem.
Right, especially if we want to use them in areas where, things are really critical.
Totally. Schneppat's spot on there. If we can't trace how an LLM got to a conclusion, it's really hard to trust it, especially in situations where the stakes are high.
Okay, then Schneppat gets into more specifics about the different types of reasoning. So we talked about deductive reasoning already. He uses that classic example. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
It's a good one because it highlights that absolute logical connection. If the first statements are true, the conclusion just has to be true.
Right. It's no way around it.
Exactly. And Schneppat stresses that this kind of reasoning, it's essential for things where certainty is key, like mathematical proofs or logic puzzles.
Then there's inductive reasoning. Schneppat says That's about those general conclusions from specific observations.
Right. Like if you've noticed that whenever you eat a certain food, you get a headache, you might start to think, maybe this food is causing my headaches. You're generalizing from those specific experiences.
Okay, I see. And Schnepphat says this is how LLMs learn from all the data they're trained on. They're spotting patterns, and then they're using those patterns to make predictions.
And in a world where we have so much data, I mean, that's a really valuable skill, right?
Totally. So Schnepphat explains abductive reasoning next. This one's about finding the most likely explanation for something you observe.
It's like a detective at a crime scene, right? They look at all the clues and try to figure out the most plausible scenario.
Oh, okay, so it's about making the best guess you can with the information you have.
Exactly. And Schnepphat suggests LLMs use this all the time to fill in those gaps in their knowledge. They're constantly trying to figure out the most likely explanations based on what they've learned.
Interesting. So then Schnepphat revisits analogical reasoning, which we touched on earlier.
Right, drawing those parallels between situations, like if a certain marketing campaign worked really well for one company, maybe another company in a similar industry could try a similar approach.
Yeah, it's like learning from past experiences. Right. And Schnepphat points out this is how LLMs can apply what they've learned to new problems. They don't always have to start from scratch.
And that makes them much more adaptable, right? Like they can build on what they already know.
Okay, and Schnepphat dives back into causal reasoning too.
Yeah.
Emphasizing that understanding of cause and effect.
Right. It's not just about knowing that something happens. It's about knowing why it happens. Like knowing that a certain medication helps with a specific symptom.
Right. And that's powerful because then you can start to make more informed decisions, more informed recommendations based on that understanding.
Exactly. Schnepphat really stresses how crucial that is. And then, just briefly, he touches on some other reasoning types. Heuristic reasoning, which is kind of like those mental shortcuts we use, non-monotonic reasoning, where you might have to change your conclusions based on new information, and then game theoretic reasoning, which is all about those strategic decisions, like in a competitive environment.
Okay, so lots of different ways of thinking going on in those LLMs.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a whole toolkit of reasoning strategies.
So how do they actually do all this? How do they manage all these different types of reasoning?
Well, Schnepphat gets into the mechanisms behind it all. He starts with that layered neural network structure.
Okay, remind me, what are those layers all about?
So it's kind of like a step-by-step process, right? Each layer in the network is doing a different level of analysis. It's building up from those simple features to more and more complex representations.
So it's like each layer is adding a bit more understanding, building on the layer before it.
Exactly. And Schnepphat emphasizes that this is super important for those more intricate reasoning tasks. It's how they break down those complex problems into manageable chunks.
Okay, that makes sense. Then Schnepphat talks about attention mechanisms. Are those like, are those like when you're reading something really complex and you kind of highlight the key words?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's like the LLM is focusing its attention on the most important parts of the input. It can kind of assign these important scores to different elements, which helps it understand the relationships between them.
So it's not just taking in everything equally, it's figuring out what's most relevant.
Exactly. And Schnepphat points out that this is crucial for understanding context. Like if you're asking an LLM a question, it needs to be able to zero in on the key parts of the question to give you a relevant answer.
And then training, that's obviously a huge part of it. Schnepphat really stresses that.
Right. The more you train these LLMs on different reasoning tasks, the better they get at drawing those conclusions and adapting their thinking. Schnepphat even gives an example of how incorporating coding data into the training can actually improve their general reasoning abilities, as well as their coding skills, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's like the more diverse their training, the more flexible they become.
Absolutely. And then Schnepphat mentions specific reasoning techniques, like the tree of thought approach.
Oh, tell me about that one. That sounds interesting.
So instead of just thinking in a straight line, step by step, the tree of thought allows the LLM to explore multiple possibilities at the same time, like branching out in different directions.
Okay, so it's not just one path. It's exploring a bunch of different options.
Exactly. And that allows it to tackle those more complex problems where, maybe there isn't just one right answer. It can try different approaches and see which one works best.
It's like a more human way of thinking, right?
Yeah.
We don't always solve problems in a perfectly linear way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying different strategies until you find one that works. But Schnepphat's careful to point out that LLMs, they still have their limitations. They're not quite at human-level reasoning yet, especially when it comes to those really nuanced logical deductions or understanding context in a really deep way.
Right, there's still a gap there.
Definitely. But there's a lot of research going on in areas like chain of thought reasoning, which is trying to make those reasoning steps more explicit, kind of like showing their work so we can understand their logic better.
Okay, so how do we even know how good these LLMs are at reasoning? How do we measure that?
Well, Schneppet talks about the evaluation methods. They're testing different types of reasoning, arithmetic, common sense, deductive reasoning, abductive reasoning, all of that.
Like giving them an exam?
Yeah, basically. They want to see how well they perform on these different tasks. And Schneppet mentions some of the benchmarks they use, like the Big Bench, which is this really broad assessment covering a whole range of reasoning abilities. And then there's the Math Benchmark, which is specifically focused on those really challenging high school level math problems.
Oh, wow. So they're really putting them through their paces.
Right, are. They want to see if these LLMs can actually solve problems that require that step-by-step logical thinking.
But Schneppet also brings up the fact that evaluating reasoning, it's not always easy, right? It's not just about those hard numbers.
No, it's not. Reasoning is a complex thing. It's not always clear-cut. And Schneppet points out that we need better ways to measure those more qualitative aspects, like how adaptable an LLM is, how well it can handle a situation it's never seen before.
Right, because the real world is messy. It's not always like a neat little math problem.
Exactly. And Schneppet suggests that for the future, for evaluating these LLMs, we need to move towards more inclusive and dynamic tasks.
Okay, what does that mean?
So it means things like assessing their ethical reasoning, their ability to understand different cultures and contexts, even their ability to work with different languages and styles of communication.
It's like we need to test them on those real-world skills, not just those abstract reasoning abilities.
Exactly. It's about making sure they can actually function in the real world in all its complexity. And of course, Schneppet doesn't shy away from the challenges and limitations that are still out there.
Yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. So one thing he brings up is the fact that a lot of these LLMs, they rely on very specific prompt structures. The way you ask them a question really matters.
Right, like they're very sensitive to the wording.
Exactly. And that suggests that maybe they're not truly understanding the question, they're just picking up on those specific keywords.
So they're not as adaptable as we might hope.
Right. And Schneppet also talks about the ongoing difficulties with causal reasoning, especially when you start changing the conditions of a problem. It shows that they don't always have this deep understanding of cause and effect.
Yeah, they can get tripped up when things get a little more complicated.
And then there's the whole prompt dependency issue. Sometimes just a tiny change in the way you phrase a question can lead to a completely different answer from the LLM.
That's kind of worrying, isn't it?
It is. It shows they're not as robust as we might like. They're still very reliant on those specific linguistic cues, and that can lead to inconsistencies in their responses.
And Schneppet points out they also still struggle in areas like math and common sense reasoning, right? Like things that seem pretty basic to us.
Exactly. They can struggle with consistently applying rules or even just understanding basic everyday knowledge.
Right, like those things we just take for granted.
And finally, Schneppet talks about the bigger picture, the potential long-term risks of these advanced LLMs.
Yeah, like what happens if their goals don't align with ours?
Exactly. And what about the potential for misuse? These are powerful tools, and we need to be thinking carefully about how we manage those risks as they continue to develop.
So it's not just about the technical stuff, it's about the ethics, too.
Absolutely. But despite all these limitations, Schneppet also outlines some really exciting applications for these LLMs. Like, one big area is in programming.
Okay, how are they helping with that?
Well, because they can apply deductive reasoning, they're getting really good at tasks like coding and debugging. It could make the whole development process much more efficient.
So they're like superpowered assistants for programmers.
In a way, yeah. And in the business world, Schneppet suggests they can be used for strategic planning and decision-making. They can analyze those huge data sets and explore different possibilities, which can help companies optimize their strategies.
So not just writing code, but helping to make those big decisions.
Exactly. And Schneppet also talks about their role in research. They can help us process and make sense of those massive amounts of data that are out there, even help with fact-checking in areas like law.
So they're becoming these powerful tools for knowledge management.
They are. And Schneppet mentions some of the advancements in reasoning techniques, like chain of thought prompting, which is helping them tackle even more complex problems.
So we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what they can do.
We are. And then there's this whole new area of using natural language as a way for them to learn and reason, which is pretty fascinating.
So it's like we're teaching them to think more like us.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, Schneppet sees some key areas for future development. He's really excited about advances in causal reasoning. He thinks that could lead to LLMs that can actually do automated creative problem solving.
Wow, so they could actually come up with new ideas, new solutions.
Exactly. And he also stresses the need for collaboration, bringing together people from different fields, computer science, psychology, ethics, all working together to make sure these LLMs are developed responsibly.
So it's not just a tech problem, it's a human problem too.
Absolutely. And then another big area is integrating different reasoning techniques, combining different approaches to make these LLMs even more adaptable and effective.
It's like giving them an even bigger toolkit.
Exactly. And finally, Schneppet really emphasizes the need for public education, making sure people understand what these LLMs are, what they can do, and what the potential risks are.
Especially before we start using them in those really sensitive areas.
Absolutely. So to kind of wrap up our deep dive into Jörg-Owe Schneppet's essay, we've really explored a lot. The different ways these LLMs are trying to reason, the complex mechanisms behind it all, the challenges they still face, the exciting applications that are emerging, and where things might be headed in the future.
And for you, the learner, here's something to think about, building on what Schneppet talks about with the limitations of causal reasoning. What do you think are those big breakthroughs that need to happen before we see LLMs that can actually think strategically at a human level in all those complex real-world situations? Maybe check out some of the research Schneppet mentions in his essay. There might be some clues there. Anyway, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into reasoning in LLMs.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. Thanks for being here.